This is a piece by Yves Coleman from 2007. Why did I say Yves Coleman? I think it's actually Yves Coleman. Yves Coleman actually commented on one of my videos before to tell me that his name is actually an English name. His father was a black American, even though he's from France. So here we go. James Petras, a chauvinist, anti-Zionist, and anti-Semitic, quote, gringo. Professor of sociology, quote, author of 62 books published in 29 languages and over 560 articles in professional journals, end quote. Contributor to French publications such as Le Monde Diplomatique or Les Thèmes Modernes, quote, Marxist journals such as the famous New Left Review and the Bourgeois Press, New York Times, The Guardian, Christian Science Monitor, Foreign Policy, etc. James Petras, his publisher, tells us that James Petras has some, quote, militant references as he, quote, collaborated with the landless peasant movement in Brazil for 11 years, unquote, and that he was a, quote, member of the Russell Tribunal against repression in Latin America. Wikipedia says the Russell Tribunal, also known as the International War Crimes Tribunal, Russell Sartre Tribunal, or Stockholm Tribunal, was a private people's tribunal organized in 1966 by Bertrand Russell, British philosopher and Nobel Prize winner, and hosted by French philosopher and writer Jean-Paul Sartre, along with Lelio Basso, Simone de Beauvoir, Vladimir Dediger, Ralph Schoenman, Isaac Deutscher, Gunther Anders, and several others. The tribunal investigated and evaluated American foreign policy and military intervention in Vietnam. Bertrand Russell justified the establishment of the Russell Tribunal as follows, quote, if certain acts and violations of treaties are crimes, they are crimes whether the United States does them or whether Germany does them. We are not prepared to lay down a rule of criminal conduct against others which we would not be willing to have invoked against us, end quote. Bertrand Russell. The tribunal was constituted in November 1966 and was conducted in two sessions in 1967 in Stockholm, Sweden, and Roskilde, Denmark. Maybe Roskilde is how you say that, I'm not sure. Bertrand Russell's book on the armed confrontations underway in Vietnam, War Crimes in Vietnam, was published in January 1967. Bertrand Russell's postscript called for establishing this investigative body. The findings of the tribunal were largely ignored in the United States. Further tribunals were also held on various other issues, including psychiatry, human rights, and the Israel-Palestine conflict, and most recently on the disputed territory of Jammu and Kashmir. I wanted to look up James Petras earlier. James Petras was born 17th of January 1937 and is a retired Bartle Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Binghamton University in Binghamton, New York, an adjunct professor at St. Mary's University, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, who has published on political issues with particular focus on Latin America and the Middle East, imperialism, globalization, and leftist social movements. Back to the text. New section. Long live the pseudo, quote, anti-imperialist dictators of the South. James Petras is the author of an article entitled in French, 12 Theses on War and Peace in the Middle East, written in June 2006, but which is not included on Petras' official website, so my quotations are retranslated from the French version. In this article, we find all the cliches of the left and far left in favor of the mullah's dictatorship over the Iranian proletariat. Like them, Petras also supports the Iraqi pseudo-quote resistance, whose main activity consists of killing Shiites, blowing up mosques, and murdering Iraqi and foreign workers. The quote mass Islamic resistance end quote in Iraq is, according to Petras, a quote national liberation movement end quote. One second. As for Iran, the quote Islamic revolution end quote is said to have quote distributed land end quote. Parenthesis, Petras does not, of course, specify either the quantity distributed or that land's importance in relation to the total amount of land exploited in Iran end parenthesis. It is said to have quote introduced pluralist elections end quote quote within limits strictly defined by Islamic law end quote. Note the Jesuitism and cynicism of this formula. Aware that he has no doubt gone too far, parenthesis, at least for a quote leftish and quote readership end parenthesis. Petras mentions quote the repression of trade union movements end quote, which has quote undermined a good part of the reforms planned by the Islamic regime end quote. Who carried out this repression if not the government supported by Petras? He hypocritically concludes his article by saying that, quote, the new president has promised to make efforts in the area of social protection, end quote. If Petras hasn't already done so, we suggest that if he hasn't already done so, we suggest that President Ahmadinejad urgently invites James Petras for a week, all expenses paid, to an Iranian seaside resort to thank him for his good and loyal services, or even better, to appoint him director of propaganda for foreign countries! Exclamation point. James Petras, who is often published in Le Monde Diplomatique in France, defends the same theses as the Gaullist, quote, Third Worldist newspaper in the service of the, quote, anti-imperialist dictators of the South, or as certain Trotskyists who find positive aspects in the Iranian regime of the mullahs and in the Iraqi far right. Footnote. This love of dictatorship knows no bounds, as Claudio Moffa, an Italian Marxist academic specializing in Africa, publishes a letter from Saddam Hussein on his website without comment. I'm not seeing any just good descriptions online of Claudio Moffa. Not surprising, the same Moffa invited Israel Shamir to speak at his university. Wikipedia says Israel Shamir, also named as Robert David Vasily Krasevsky, Joran Yermas, and Adam Ermash, is a Swedish writer and journalist known for his ties to WikiLeaks and for promoting anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. His son, Johannes Wallström, is a spokesperson for WikiLeaks in Sweden. Shamir has published or self-published a number of his books. His book, Flowers of Galilee, published in 2004, was banned for a time in France over allegations it was inciting racial hatred and anti-Semitism. Back to the text. This whole, quote, anti-Zionist world operates, in parentheses, fairly, end parentheses, transparent networks and shares the same political phobias as the nationalist revolutionary far right, parentheses, the heirs of the national Bolsheviks of the 1920s, end parentheses, are the most extreme supporters of political Islam. End footnote. There's a footnote that I missed. I guess this is a quote from his latest book, The Power of Israel in the United States, published by Clarity Press. A quote, human rights publisher, and quote, as the advert puts it, fortunately these people tell us that they are in favor. Fortunately these people tell us that they are in favor. Fortunately these people tell us that they are in favor of human rights. Reading the description of James Petras's Power of Israel in the United States. This book is a chapter-by-chapter analysis and documentation of the power of Israel via the Israeli, Jewish, or pro-Zionist lobby on U.S. Middle East policy. It raises serious questions as to the primary beneficiary of U.S. policy and its destructive results for the United States. The extraordinary extent of U.S. political, economic, military, and diplomatic support for the State of Israel is explored, along with the means whereby such support is generated and consolidated, contending that Zionist power in America ensures unconditional U.S. backing for Israeli colonization of Palestine and its massive uprooting of Palestinians. It views the interests of Israel rather than those of big oil as the primary cause of the disastrous U.S. wars against Iraq and threats of war against Iran and Syria. It demonstrates and condemns U.S. imitation of Israeli practice as it relates to conduct of the war on terrorism and torture. It sheds light on the AIPAC spying scandal and other Israeli espionage against America, the fraudulent and complicit role of America's academic, quote, terrorist experts in furthering criminal government policies, and the orchestration of the Danish cartoons to foment antipathy between Muslims in the West. It questions the inability in America to sustain and even formulate a discourse related to the subject of Israeli influence on the United States. It calls for a review of American Mideast policy with a view to reclaiming U.S. independence of action based upon enlightened self-interest and progressive principles. Back to the text and footnote. Where am I? To cap it all, Petras writes in his article that the, quote, Middle Eastern upper classes were stunned throughout the world by the loss of human lives, end quote, caused by the 11th of September attacks, as if the massacre of 2,700 people could only move and revolt privileged or reactionary individuals. Exclamation point. New section for a, quote, enlightened foreign policy that takes account of the, quote, national interest of American imperialism. I don't know whether James Petras shares Thierry Meyssan's lunatic theses on September 11th. Theses welcomed at all the social forms of the No Global movement. But what is certain is that his discourse is worthy of a chauvinistic American politician concerned with the well-understood interests of the American bourgeoisie and the American state. Wikipedia says Thierry Meyssan is a French journalist, left-wing conspiracy theorist, and political activist. He is the author of investigations into the extreme right-wing, particularly France's National Front militias, as well as into the Catholic Church. Meyssan's book, 9/11, The Big Lie, challenges the official account of events of the September 11th terrorist attacks. And this book says, the Wikipedia for this page says, 9/11, The Big Lie, or The Horrifying Fraud, is the original title of a highly controversial and discredited 2002 book by French journalist and political activist Thierry Meyssan. Its English edition is entitled 9/11, The Big Lie. The book argues that the attacks of September 11th, 2001 were, quote, false flag operations directed by right-wingers in the U.S. government and the military-industrial complex who sought a casus belli for military action in Afghanistan and Iraq. A publishing sensation in France, the book has received severe criticism over its factuality in both the French and United States mainstream news media. The U.S. government has publicly denounced the book and considers it a significant international misinformation threat. The crux of the criticism emphasizes that the book contradicts much eyewitness and forensic evidence, and so cannot be accepted as a factual account. The book reported to have sustained a number one bestseller position. The book reported to have sustained a number one bestseller position in France for 6 of 7 weeks immediately after its launch, sold 100,000 copies in the first year. 164,100 copies in the first year, and a total of 300,000 copies up to date. Bracket citation needed, end bracket. It has since been translated into 28 languages as of 2006. Back to the text. I don't know whether James Petras shares Thierry Meyssan's lunatic theses on September 11th. Theses welcomed at all the social forms of the No Global movement, but what is certain is that his discourse is worthy of a chauvinistic American politician concerned with the well-understood interests of the American bourgeoisie and the American state. Footnote. Boulevard Voltaire, Thierry Meyssan's website, republished in French 15 articles written by James Petras between 2005 and 2015. End footnote. James Petras' theses are perfectly in line with those of John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago and Stephen Walt of Harvard University, authors of the study titled The Israel Lobby and American Foreign Policy. The abstract for this paper says, in this paper, John J. Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago's Department of Political Science and Stephen M. Walt of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government contend that the centerpiece of U.S. Middle East policy its intimate relationship with Israel. The authors argue that although often justified as reflecting shared strategic interests or compelling moral imperatives, the U.S. commitment to Israel is due primarily to the activities of the, quote, Israel lobby. This paper goes on to describe the various activities that pro-Israel groups have undertaken in order to shift U.S. foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. Back to the text. This text circulated on all the indie medias and other radical alternative anti-Zionist sites around the world without anyone noticing the reactionary viewpoint behind it. In fact, the two academics were not criticizing the U.S. government's support for Israel from the point of view of the interests of American, Israeli, or Palestinian proletarians, but solely from the point of view of a better defense of the well-understood interests of their imperialism. Like the two reactionary academics mentioned above, James Petras, in his latest book, The Power of Israel in the United States, explains that, quote, it is not control of oil reserves that drives U.S. imperialism to attack Iraq and threaten Iran and Syria, end quote. No, it is, quote, defending Israel's interests, end quote. Like a good chauvinist, quote, gringo, Petras is indignant about, quote, Israeli spying on the United States, end quote, and would like his country to regain, quote, independence of action based on enlightened defense of the national interest and progressive principles, end quote. That's enough to make Wall Street and the multinationals tremble. New section, From Anti-Zionism to Left-Wing Anti-Semitism. In their article on left-wing anti-Semitism in Poland, Peter Kenzorek and August Grabski referred to another text by James Petras, quote, Palestine, the Final Solution in Jose Saramago, written on the 2nd of April 2002 and republished in Polish in Lewa Noga number 14. I don't see anything for Peter Kenzorek. Let's see about August Grabski. It looks like August Grabski works at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. August Grabski is an assistant professor at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, Poland. He received his Ph.D. in Jewish Studies from the University of Warsaw. Dr. Grabski is fluent in Polish and English, and his proficiency in French, Russian, and Yiddish. While in residence at the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, Dr. Grabski conducted research on his project, The Jews and Guerrilla Units in Polish Forest. Dr. Grabski's publications in Polish include The Central Committee of Polish Jews, 1944 to 1950, A Political History, and The Left Against Israel, Studies on the Jewish Left Anti-Zionism, published in 2008. He co-authored The Jewish Military Union, A Restored History in 2008, The Activity of Communists Among Jews in Poland, 1944 to 1949, along with Agata Nowakowska. Dr. August Grabski also co-authored The Decades, 1995 to 2005, which has sold over 100,000 copies. He is the author of many scholarly articles, including Jews and Political Life in Poland from 1944 to 1949, Jewish Presence and Absence, The Aftermath of the Holocaust in Poland, 1944 to 2010, and Jewish Religious Life in Poland After the Holocaust, and co-authored Jewish Presence and Absence, The Aftermath of Holocaust in Poland, 1944 to 2010, with Yad Vashem. Finally, August Grabsky has edited Rebels Against Zion, Studies on the Jewish Anti-Zionist Left, 2011, and co-edited Nations and Political Studies, which is dedicated to Professor Jerzy Tomaszewski, in English and Polish, respectively. Okay, back to the text. And who else do I want to look up? Jose Saramago. Wikipedia says Jose Saramago lived from 1922 to 2010 and was a Portuguese writer. Jose Saramago was the recipient of the 1998 Nobel Prize in Literature for his, quote, parables sustained by imagination, compassion, and irony, bracket, with which he, and bracket, continually enables us once again to comprehend an illusory reality, end quote. Jose Saramago's works, some of which can be seen as allegories, commonly present subversive perspectives on historic events, emphasizing the theopoetic human factor. In 2003, Harold Bloom described Saramago as, quote, the most gifted novelist alive in the world today, end quote, and in 2010 said he considers Saramago to be a, quote, permanent part of the Western canon, end quote, while James Wood praises, quote, the distinctive tone to his fiction because he narrates his novels as if he were someone both wise and ignorant, end quote. More than 2 million copies of Saramago's books have been have been sold in Portugal alone, and his work has been translated into 25 languages. A proponent of libertarian communism, Saramago criticized institutions such as the Catholic Church, the European Union, and the International Monetary Fund. An atheist, Jose Saramago defended love as an instrument to improve the human condition. In 1992, the government of Portugal, under Prime Minister Aníbal Cavaco Silva, ordered the removal of one of Jose Saramago's works, The Gospel According to Jesus Christ, from the Aristideon Prize's shortlist, claiming the work was religiously offensive. Disheartened by this political censorship of his work, Saramago went into exile on the Spanish island of Lanzarote, where he lived alongside his Spanish wife Pilar del Rio until his death in 2010. Jose Saramago was a founding member of the National Front for the Defense of Culture in Lisbon in 1992. Back to the text. In their article on left-wing communism in Poland, published in Ni Patrii ni Frontiere, Peter Kędziorek and August Grabsky refer to another text by James Petras, Palestine, the Final Solution, and Jose Saramago, written on the 2nd of April 2002, and republished in Polish in Lewa Noga, number 14. This article comments on statements made by the Portuguese writer Jose Saramago in Ramallah in March 2002. Quote, what we have to do is to sound the alarm all over the world, to say that what is happening in Palestine is a crime that we can stop. We can compare it to what happened in Auschwitz, ... Israeli repression is the most perverse form of apartheid, end quote. James Petras, of course, defends Jose Saramago by asserting that, quote, the Israelis carrying out a genocide against an entire people, end quote. Quote, the descendants of Holocaust survivors are claiming a monopoly on the use of the word, end quote, parenthesis, genocide, end parenthesis. Quote, victims can become executioners, end quote, and that the Jews, quote, are the rentiers of the Holocaust, end quote. Note this recycling of an old anti-Semitic cliche, the denunciation of the Jews' relationship with money, its most, quote, immoral and parasitic form, usury yesterday, quote, rents today. Judeophobes certainly don't have much imagination, ... But Petras doesn't stop there. Like many anti-Zionist radicals, Petras quotes this infamous officer about Jenin, who, about Jenin, declared that the techniques used by the Nazis against the insurgents in the Warsaw Ghetto should be used as a model. This assertion... let me repeat. I feel like didn't convey the meaning of that sentence right. But Petras doesn't stop there. Like many anti-Zionist radicals, Petras quotes this (in and parenthesis) quote famous end quote officer who, about Jenin, declared that the techniques used by the Nazis against the insurgents in the Warsaw Ghetto should be used as a model. This assertion is banal. One must be particularly ignorant to believe that in the military schools of the imperialist countries, as well in the training camps of all far-left guerrillas, one would never study the methods of the adversary, however barbaric and bloodthirsty he may be. Knowing the enemy's methods well and even turn them against them is a question of military survival, not a moral issue! Exclamation point. In fact, Petras' objective is different. Petras wants to manipulate the reader's indignation to suggest an amalgam between Jews or Israelis and the Nazis. In doing so, Petras is simply repeating a procedure used by Holocaust deniers for years, who need to assert the identity between Jews and Nazis. Hence expressions such as, quote, Judeo-Nazis or, quote, Zion-Nazis, which can also be found on so-called, quote, radical websites such as Indie Media, and then claim that the Shoah never actually took place. It is no coincidence that Israel Shamir warmly recommends James Petras' last book, The Power of Israel in the United States, as can be seen from the quotation on the website of Petras' publishing house. Shamir, who declares on the same site that, quote, Jewish power is shaping American policy in the Middle East against the interests of big oil, end quote! Exclamation point. So Bush is hostile to the interests of big oil. That's one defined! Exclamation point. In his article, Palestine, the Final Solution, and Jose Saramago, Petras writes, quote, like in Germany, all Palestinian males from 16 to 60 years are rounded up, many are stripped naked, interrogated, handcuffed, many are tortured, end quote. As if the Nazis were content with rounding up people and not exterminating all the Jews afterwards! Exclamation point. As if the Nazis were content with rounding people up and not exterminating all the Jews afterwards! Exclamation point. The, quote, skill of this anti-Semitic columnist consists in concealing what happened after these roundups. He then adds, quote, as with the Nazis, hundreds of wounded Palestinians are left to die as Israeli troops block all ambulances, end quote. Which is perfectly true, which is a war crime, a crime against humanity, ... but not a genocide. Finally, Petras no longer even hides his anti-Semitism when he writes, quote, there is no power in the United States which can counter the money and influence of the Israeli lobby and its powerful Jewish allies, end quote. In short, the Jews dominate the American empire, which in turn dominates the world. All that's missing is a reference to the Protocol of the Elders of Zion, and we've come full circle. This is the type of author that a Polish Trotskyist publishes in the so-called, quote, revolutionary press of his country! Exclamation point. The end. Thank you so much for listening.